Good morning and welcome to this special edition of 1 John 5:8. So I recorded a video on 1 John 5:8 yesterday, September the 13th, Friday the 13th, 2019. But I got a little contentious in that video and believed I should reshoot it with a little bit more fairness. And I want to thank the loyal opposition, as they say, for sharpening my knowledge of details, um, and it'll make a better video as a result. So let's begin by translating this, if you have an ability. So this is the text as it is in modern critical editions of the Greek New Testament. Of course, none of the conclusions have changed between yesterday and today in terms of its originality. It is the consensus of the overwhelming majority of textual scholars, and in my opinion, a definitive conclusion that this is the way it read originally. The Spirit and the water and the blood and these three are one, or the three are into the one. So if you take 1 John 5:7 and 1 John 5:8 together, they would read, "And there are three who are witnessing, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and the three are one." And this is the way it likely read. And it would seem to me that this was not a statement about the Trinity at all, that this original wording here was, again, targeting Docetists, that is, early Gnostics, who believed that Jesus had only seemed to become human, that he had adopted into a body at the baptism as a possibility, the Spirit and the water. But they denied the blood of Christ. That is, they denied the the need for the atoning efficacy of Christ's death. They denied that Christ had died. They did not believe that Jesus had come in the flesh. Jesus was a spirit being. And so these three witnesses are witnesses to Christ rather than witnesses to the Trinity. And in fact, the Spirit is uh, even in the expanded version, the Spirit is in both, which is a little strange. So originally, this was a statement about um, three things that give witness to Jesus, the most unique of which, in relation to the Dostis, is the blood. So here's how the expanded version of this verse reads. And go ahead and see if you can translate it. So here's my translation. "And there are three who witness on earth, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these three are one." So this is entirely here. What is added is, "and there are three who are witnessing on earth." So in the Textus Receptus, which is the received text that became the basis for the King James version, it has additional words, "and there are three who are witnessing." And then in verse 7, it has the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, and these three are one. And then it has in verse 8, "and there are three who are witnessing on earth." So those who are witnessing in heaven, those who are witnessing on earth. I think I left out in heaven. So it makes it a very, very good Trinitarian statement. And there's nothing at all wrong with the theology of these verses in the expanded text. Again, I have no problem with the verses, and I thank you to my critiquer for pointing out the article by De Jonge. I read quite a bit of it, and De Jonge does a quite good work showing that some of the legend uh, seems to have been expanded from what the evidence actually um, indicates for Erasmus's inclusion of this into his third edition of his Greek New Testament. More on that in a second. But so we have the Greek here, and what seems to have been the case is that the Latin tradition expanded this. Now, I don't agree with those, so I thank you again to my critic. I looked at the alleged allusion to this in Tertullian. It doesn't seem to me that that's sustainable. Tertullian simply says these three are one. Um, it's not a clear allusion to the expanded form of this because it says these three are one in either version. And so it's possible that Tertullian interpreted this verse in relation to the Trinity, but that doesn't show that he was quoting it. Cyprian is considered by some to be a witness against the inclusion uh, of this added words, the comma Johannium, um, in part because of the way he words it. It doesn't seem that he's quoting. Seems that he's interpreting again. And so, what is definitive, I don't see any way that this is not definitive, is that Athanasius, who of course is known as the real driving force behind the church endorsing the Trinitarian view. And of course, Athanasius is the champion of the Trinity in the 300s, when at one point there were more Arians who didn't believe in the Trinity than there were Trinitarians. Athanasius never mentions this verse in any of his surviving writings. That's definitive because this verse would have been ground zero for the entire Trinitarian debate in the 300s. It would have been the central biblical text under discussion. And so the fact that Athanasius doesn't mention it is definitive against it. And of course, the fact that there are only 8 Greek manuscripts that have it. And in these 8 manuscripts, in most, it's either in the margin, in an even later hand. There's only evidence of maybe one Greek manuscript that has it prior to the 1500s. So now there are lots of Latin manuscripts that have it. The majority of Latin manuscripts, over 90%, I guess, of the Latin manuscripts have this text. One of my commentators, John, I think, was mentioning that Daniel Wallace had argued that this edition shouldn't be in the New King James. So basically, it is a very, very rare scholar who argues that these words were in the original. And let me say it in a toned-down version. Intellect does not map with correct conclusions. I would argue that many of those who argue for this inclusion are very, very intelligent indeed. My friend, I don't know, he may not be my friend, James Snap, who argues for I don't know whether he argues for the inclusion of this particular verse, but who argues for the originality of Mark 16:9-20. James is obviously an incredibly intelligent individual. In fact, in many respects, and I said this in the first version of this video, is that I've sometimes felt like I just wasn't smart enough to come up with some of the ingenious ways of explaining the data. And so, I at some point I just, you know what, I'm going to go with the way the evidence seems to point. And I am a big picture person. I am not by nature gifted at minor details. That's a weakness in many contexts, but it's also a strength in that in many cases I see the big picture where a detailed person does not. All of that aside, it is just simply, in my opinion, beyond a reasonable doubt that the text as it now appears in modern versions of the Bible is indeed the way it was. Now to the Erasmus story. The sensational version is, of course, much more fun than de Jonge's kind of more circumspect analysis of the evidence. So Bruce Metzger has in his famous The Text of the New Testament, a story of basically Erasmus. Of course, nobody disagrees that the added words were not in the first and second editions of Erasmus's Greek New Testament. Nor does anybody dispute that Erasmus did not seem to think that these words were original. He did include it in his third edition in 1522, I believe it was. And de Jonge argues that he did it, he's very circumspect in his argument. By the way, I don't think de Jonge thinks that this is original. He's simply correcting a historical anecdote. Um, Erasmus probably included it to avoid charges of heresy and to make sure that his printed Greek New Testament didn't wane in its sales. Erasmus, my impression is, was a good salesman, a good marketer. I have a blog post, Erasmus Wins, that somewhat captures my philosophy of innovation. But anyway, that's another tangent for another day. But uh, Erasmus included it probably so his Greek New Testament would sell, and so that he didn't get into problems with the church, because there were some voices that critiqued him strongly for not putting it in. And the way Metzger puts the story is that Erasmus says, if somebody can produce one Greek New Testament that has this reading in it, then I'll put it in. And so one was quickly produced. The ink was still wet. That kind of story. Now, de Jonge has shown that the actual quotes don't bear up this version of the story. That the earliest fuller version of the story is not until the early 1800s. And so, having read some of the actual quotes, again, thank you to some of the voices out there on YouTube. Having read some of the actual quotes, his interaction with a guy named Lee at, I think, Oxford, seems to indicate what he's basically saying is, I was not able to find this writing, nor can you show that I found this writing. If somebody had been able to give me this writing, I don't remember the exact wording, but he does say something like, if somebody had been able to show me this writing, I might have included it. So this actually doesn't disprove that a manuscript was produced to demonstrate to him that it was in the Greek, or that a manuscript was produced with it in it as a result of him not having it in his first and second edition. So there could actually be a cause-effect relationship between the production of this manuscript, which I think was produced in Ireland. It's manuscript 61. 61 was presented to Erasmus, and Erasmus did in between 1520 and 1521. Apparently, this manuscript was presented to Erasmus, and Erasmus did include it. So you can see that there are the skeleton of the story has some truth to it. The sensational version of it, if anybody can produce one manuscript, probably is not borne up by the evidence. But the evidence does suggest that a manuscript was produced around this time. Erasmus calls it a recent manuscript. So you can see the story grew out of dots that are there, even though it probably goes well beyond what the evidence is. Well, all that's fun. This is a fun passage. And again, nothing wrong with the theology of the verse. It's just not likely a verse that was, or it's not likely material that was in the original copy of First John. Okay, so the translation: the Spirit and the water and the blood and the three into the one are. Okay, there you have it. Easy. And then here for the additional material in the comma Johannium. And three are the ones witnessing on the earth, and then the rest is the same. Nothing, the Spirit and the water. So the grammar, there was nothing really exciting about the grammar except the word for one. The word for one is, of course, a frustrating thing to beginning Greek students everywhere, because the word for one is hais, and it looks like ace, the preposition, but the preposition ace does not have an accent and has a smooth breathing mark, whereas the word for one has a rough breathing mark and an accent. So it's hais. This is the masculine form. The feminine form is Mia, which looks completely differently. And then the neuter form is hen, which again annoyingly looks like N, which is the preposition with a smooth breathing mark and no accent. So the word for one in its masculine, feminine, and neuter form looks like other prepositions, which makes it somewhat annoying. By the way, the word for one only occurs in the singular. Anyway, so we get to the pronunciation. Can you pronounce it? Here's my pronunciation. To panuma kai to hudor, kai to haima, kai hoi trace, ace to hen, acen. So to pronounce it at normal speed, to panuma, kai to hudor, kai to haima, kai hoi trace, ace to hen, acen. And here's the longer one. Can you pronounce it? And here's my pronunciation. Kai trace, acen, hoi, martu runtes, en te gay, to panuma, kai to hudor, kai to haima, kai hoi trace, ace to hen, acen. Let me try to do it at normal speed. Kai trace acen hoi marturuntes en te gay, to panuma, kai to hodor, kai to haima, kai hoi trace, ace to hen, acen. So this has been the revised standard version of 1 John 5:8. See you on Monday.